Dr. Oswald Migla walked through the Siren Industries door after showing his ID card to two brutes outside. He looked at his sheet again. West Wing, Room 6. According to the man who gave him the job, he'd be giving a test subject a new experimental drug. One of a kind, an exclusive chance that only he had the honor to test out. He looked around. He couldn't see any direction to anywhere. It was a jumbled mess of doors and vending machines. It was one day on the job, and to his dismay, he had no idea where to go. He looked around for the reception, left, right, and then left again. A woman was sitting down on a blindly white desk. Her face was emotionless. Her head was tilted slightly to the right. He hadn't seen her sitting there the first time. Frowning, Dr. Migla went to the desk. Yes. Excuse me. I'm looking for... Dr. Migla stuttered. He couldn't speak. He wished he could stop unmuting and erring and just talk clear. His voice was always been embarrassingly high. To save himself, he held up his sheet, and the lady working there showed him the way. She seemed quite pretty, despite her blank face and complexion. She was pale. Her skin was whiter than a bone. Everything was white here. White or gray, Dr. Migla thought. His second door to your left, straight on, then to your right. Thank you. Goodbye, she said, all at once. Her voice was just blank as her face. Her lips barely seemed to move at all. They didn't match what she was saying, like a badly out-of-sync movie. Thank you, Miss, he glanced at her name card. Miss Harpy. Harpy, he quickly said. Miss Harpy. He expected some kind of reply. Instead, she just sat there, with her wide eyes seemed to be looking right through him. He shrugged and carried on, turning to his left at the end of the room. Shortly after him, another young man walked through the door, Dr. Desmond Trinity. He moved his long brown hair away from his eyes. He had to find his room, West Wing, Room 7. He'd only look at the paper once, yet he still remembered. Photographic memory. He was trying out a new drug for patients, apparently. A one-in-a-kind experiment that he only had the honor to try out. Dr. Migla carried on to the directions he was given, and as he turned right, noted a sign, West Wing. He was going the right way, at least, despite that this was remarkably unimpressed at the colossal building. It was gray and dull, and after all the hype around this place, he sort of expected mutants and monsters to run amok this building. Siren Industries was an ugly, grim place. The building seemed to sneer down on the people below, living its own life and ignoring everything else around it. It was gray, bleak, and had tiny barred windows that were almost impossible to see into. It was a testing lab for diseases, medication, and experimental studies. Steam and smoke poured out of the chimney like blood from a wound. The smoke was black and inky, therefore making duller weather even duller. The gloomy atmosphere even gloomier, like an exhaust pipe from the hell's flames. At the door there were two security guards, muscular titans of men. Each stood as still as a tobacco shop Indian. Anyone who tried to sneak by them rarely left without a few broken ribs. Getting in without permission wasn't very common, and if someone did get in, no one ever saw them get out. Hardly anyone had ever been in Siren Industries, and yet there were complaints and petitions against it. Environmentalists, animal rights petitioners, and even common low-life living in area thought it should be run to the ground. And yet if terrible people were living in there, thought the building was wrong, and trust, it must be some quite foul. It was no secret that Siren Industries was some pretty inhumane experiments going on inside, given the toxic and chemical smoke, as well as the frequent newspaper articles claiming that there was animal abuse. The building didn't have a best reputation. In addition to this, every fortnight or two, vans would come out of the building handling crates that gave angry animalistic screeches from inside. One guard would swiftly place something in the driver's pocket, and they'd be gone without a word. Animal cruelty went mad over the place, TPing it with crude messages with spray paint. One particularly driven hippie had got into the site's dumpsters to see what all the proof he was needed, according to him anyway. He said there were mutilated animals in garbage bags, some with extra limbs, some with lacking limbs, some with odd colors, even some with deformed beyond comprehension. This had caused quite a stir in the neighborhood, but the hippie in question disappeared from the town shortly after. Some say Siren Industries gave him money to get away, but bluntly suspected that they'd take care of him. However, the town's outrage had recently died down to shift focus on all of the disappearing tramps around the area. Despite the burning hatred for the place, Siren Industries stood as tall, repulsive, and as arrogant as ever. No one could ever find any evidence against it, and sadly, most people had given up by then. Anyway, what did he get? White, dull corridors, giving a very melancholy feel. It was just like any other hospital or science center. Duller than dull, grayer than gray. He was about to move on when he heard a high ringing noise, quiet and present. He put his index finger to his ear, yet it softly rang in the corner of his mind. Probably his ears are just being funny. He looked at the walls of hallways, noticed two portraits that hung on the walls. One was a stern-looking woman with a disapproving face, probably the founder of Siren Industries. She had a face that would make children feel guilty for misbehaving. "I am not angry. I am disappointed," it seemed to declare. Another was a piece of classical artwork, Medusa, being beheaded as a brave young hero clutched her beheaded skull. Her face snarling viciously, they made him become sweaty and fidgety. He continued to walk on, to the left and then to his right. Room 1, Room 2, Room 3, Room 4. Dr. Migla stopped on the spot and clutched his ears in pain. A sharp, stinging noise had run through his ear, almost like something had poked his brain with a sharp icicle. It was that ringing noise again, only now it was more shrill and painful. He winded and stumbled on, clutching the walls as he did so. The noise slowly dimmed down until disappearing altogether. Room 5, Room 6. He knocked on the door. Nothing answered. Carefully and cautiously, he pulled the handle and creaked it open into the small room. The room was plain as others, a rectangular room, small and gray in color. A single table with two chairs on the opposite sides of each other. There was a bottle of water in a small jar on the table, presumably for the patient. The room was quiet, awkwardly quiet, like the silence would follow a conversation breaker, almost like it was vacuuming all the sound out of the room. There was a tiny camera in the room, watching him in anticipation. Dr. Migla guessed that they were workers there, monitoring the experiment. He took a seat. The subject would arrive soon, any minute now. He fidgeted with his thumbs. It was awfully ominous and eerie in the room, alone in the quiet. He looked at the jar. Experimental pills. Sidey. The rest was too small to read, besides the 50 pills label. Room 3, Room 4. Dr. Trinity carried on, merely glimpsing at some pictures, one of a grumpy woman, another of Medusa being killed. Her face had given him a shiver down his spine. It reminded him of his nightmares he used to have, the ones with the witch. Suddenly a shrill noise came into Dr. Trinity's ears, causing him to stumble and grab onto the walls. He winced. It felt like a fire alarm rattling inside his skull. Although shaken, he made his way through room 7. For the second time, a high noise had caught him off guard. He entered the rectangular room, small, gray in color, a single table with two chairs on the opposite sides of each other. There was a small bottle of water and a small jar on the table. A tiny camera sat on the ceiling. He sat down and fiddled with his thumbs. It was awfully ominous in the room. He waited for the subject. Did the subject know that he was taking pills? Or was the subject even willing to? You never know with this place, he laughed to himself. Any second now. Dr. Meagle thought back to his childhood, how his mother never had faith in him. He'd always look at space magazines and science shows, and how he prided himself in his science skills. His mother would simply put down her wine box and tell him he'd never do it, to give up work at the boozer. Now look at me, Mother, he said bitterly to himself. Who's won now? Here he was, with a PhD, trying out an experimental drug on a patient. He'd been waiting for this moment for how long? His thoughts stopped, and he frowned. How long had he? He was suddenly very puzzled. He couldn't, for the life of him, figure out what had happened before this. He tried to think back to yesterday. Yesterday, for God's sakes! Nothing. Just a blank slate, like a missing data file on a computer. All he seemed to know in his mind was buried, of his mother doubting him to his uncomfortable memories, the kind that made him sweat and feel nauseated. He couldn't remember his own life. Dr. Trinity was sitting down. This room made him feel uneasy. He felt all of his childhood monsters were waiting for him here, waiting for him to jump out into the shadows and make him cry again. Just how he felt when he first saw the Wizard of Oz and experienced looking at the Wicked Witch. He cried and ran out of the rooms as his siblings mocked him for being a ball baby. He squinted uncomfortably. He didn't want to think back to these memories, but oddly, that was all he seemed to be able to do. Think back to her pointed nose, her green skin, and the screeching voice. Come to think of it, he couldn't remember anything else. All he remembered was the grotesque face of the witch. Nothing else. Not even yesterday. He couldn't remember his life. Meanwhile, in the next room, Dr. Meagle was struggling. His vision was becoming blurry and unfocused. Sweat began to form on his brow, hot sweat that made him go red color. Dr. Meagle was increasingly getting more ill until he stood up and leaned against the table. His body was shaking, and he was dizzy beyond belief. Where was the test subject? He should have been here by now. He was struggling to breathe. He was thinking back to the past, how he couldn't remember it. The life he never had. He groggily lurched for the water, and fate rung in his head. His clumsy movement had knocked him over, and he spilled the pills. They spewed all across the table. He had little interest in them. He took a desperate gulp of the water. He winced. It tasted odd and chemical, like chloroform. This wasn't ordinary water. They put something in it, spiked it with something. He looked at the pills, his legs becoming weaker. From what he can little remember, he'd been a whiz at maths. He counted the pills quickly. 46, 47, 48. 48 pills. He remembered the label. 50 pills. 2 pills short. Suddenly, a high, shrill screech thundered across the room. He let out a starting yelp and fell to the floor, clutching his ears. God, the noise! Oh God, the noise! Shook through his whole body until his body was screaming from inside. The feeling was something similar to being corkscrewed in the head. At the corner of the room was a bone-pale woman, dressed in tethered wedding dress. Her face was terrible, and she was practically a skeleton. Her skin had a sick bluish color that reminded him of infection and disease. Veins like spiderwebs visible through grotesque features. Her hair dangled lifelessly like straw and dead snakes as termites crawled around it, giving a faint scuttle. Her mouth was impossibly wide, stretching to ridiculous lengths. Her mouth was full of yellow fangs, riddled with chips and cracks. And the worst of all, it bellowed this devilish cry, higher and louder than anything else. Her mouth was a huge pit, and the hole ready to suck him up and make him disappear. Her eyes were the worst. They were piercing, they were huge. However, in a way, they had a disapproving look. The look a mother would give when finding out her child was playing with knives. I'm not angry, just disappointed. A look of authority, a look strangely like his mother. I'm sorry, Mommy, he whispered over the deafening noise. I'm so sorry. In the next room, Dr. Trinity was sobbing on the floor, his brains being shattered by the bellowed cry of a woman in the corner of the room, with her green skin, her pointed nose, her black clothing. He had become sick and dizzy and drank the water, which he had quickly realized had been spiked with the pill. Then his witch had appeared in the corner of the room. He desperately clutched the door and shook furiously. Locked. He was stuck with this demon. I'll get you, and your little dog too, he mumbled insanely over the running stream of tears down his face. From behind the camera, a scientist watched, chuckling to himself. There were two TVs, both showing similar images. In both was a single man laying on the ground, sobbing, clutching his ears, one mumbling about his mother, one quoting The Wizard of Oz. The scientist looked pleased. The experiment had progressed beautifully. Another scientist came in, younger and thinner, delivering the drinks. He saw the TV images. Ah, the Banshee project. The younger one stared in awe. This one had sounded somewhat interesting. The elder let out a deep, unpleasant laugh. Can you imagine? This pill as a weaponized gas? No military base could stop it. Nobody could stop us. Enough complaints and those damn government searches, the younger one added, and a swig of coffee. Where do you even find people to do this? The elder one did not reply, but simply tapped his finger on the newspaper headline. Where are the homeless going? Neither one said anything. The younger one let out a knowing grin. The older one let out a satisfied nod. Siren Industries, in a way, is forward. Future projects such as deceased reanimation and cryogenic freezing will revolutionize the world as we know it. We will rise above the pitiful village. The older one grabbed his coffee and took a sip. To the future, the younger one said chirpily as he raised his glass. To the future. They clinked their glasses and continued to watch the first step of hell on earth take place.